Montana Territory, October 1891. While families across the Bitterroot Valley were stockpiling firewood by the cord and boarding up their cabins against the approaching winter, 14-year-old Thomas Harlan was doing something that made absolutely no sense to anyone watching. He was dragging salvaged timbers, discarded iron stove parts, and armloads of riverstone into the mouth of an abandoned copper mine that hadn't produced ore in 6 years. The mine shaft descended at a sharp angle into the western slope of Mineral Ridge, a worthless piece of ground that even the mining company had written off after the copper vein played out. Thomas had been living in that hole in the ground for 3 weeks, and he had no intention of leaving before the snows came. "Boy's gonna freeze to death in that rat hole before Thanksgiving," said Clayton Brewster at the Saturday gathering outside Hanson's General Store, loud enough for half the town to hear. Brewster owned the largest ranch in the valley, employed 16 men, and had just finished constructing a new barn with double-thick walls and a cast-iron stove that cost more than most families earned in a year. Living in a played-out mine like some kind of animal, it's unnatural. Someone ought to drag him out of there before we have to dig his corpse out come spring. But Thomas had no intention of being dragged anywhere. He had spent 2 years living with his Uncle Vernon after the diphtheria took both his parents in the winter of 1889. And Vernon had made it abundantly clear that Thomas was a burden, an extra mouth that ate more than he contributed. The final confrontation had come in late September, when Thomas questioned why they were building the winter woodshed above ground instead of partially underground, like his grandmother had done back in Ohio. Vernon had backhanded him across the mouth hard enough to split his lip, called him an ungrateful fool who thought he knew better than his elders, and told him to get out and stay out. Thomas had left with a wool blanket, his father's hammer and saw, his grandmother's journal wrapped in oilcloth, and $23 he'd saved from odd jobs. He had walked 12 miles into the hills before he found the abandoned mine, and the moment he stepped inside and felt the difference in temperature between the autumn wind outside and the still air within, he knew his grandmother had been right about everything she'd taught him. Before we continue with Thomas's remarkable story, I want to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story of how a 14-year-old orphan survived a winter that killed 17 people across Montana Territory, using nothing but an abandoned mine and wisdom everyone else had forgotten, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel for more incredible stories of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Your support helps us bring you more amazing true stories like this one. Now, let's get back to Thomas's story. Thomas's grandmother, Mary Harlan, had been a practical woman who'd grown up in the limestone cave country of southern Ohio, where German and Scots-Irish settlers had learned from the Shawnee that the earth itself was the best insulation against both heat and cold. She'd kept a root cellar that extended 15 feet into a hillside, and Thomas remembered summer afternoons when he was 8 and 9 years old, sitting in that cool darkness while she taught him to read the dirt. "Feel that?" she'd said, pressing his palm flat against the packed earth wall in July, when the temperature outside was pushing 90 degrees. 55 degrees. Doesn't matter if it's winter or summer up there. Down here, the earth keeps its own temperature. That's because once you get below the frost line, the ground doesn't know what season it is. The sun can't reach it, and the cold can't penetrate deep enough to matter. People build their houses up in the air, where every degree of heat they make just flies away into the sky. Then they wonder why they freeze. She'd shown him how to identify clay soils that held moisture, sandy soils that drained, and loam that did both. She'd explained thermal mass, though she'd never called it that. She'd just said that dense materials like stone and earth absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly, while wood and air gained and lost heat fast. She'd taught him that conventional farmhouses with their thin walls and pitched roofs were designed for fashion and appearance, not for the serious business of staying alive when winter turned mean. His grandmother had died in the spring of 1888, and his parents had followed her 17 months later. Thomas had tried to explain her principles to Uncle Vernon once, suggesting they could cut their firewood needs by 2/3 if they built into the hillside instead of on top of it. But Vernon had told him that Mary Harlan had been an odd woman with odd ideas, and that proper people didn't live in holes like prairie dogs. Now, Thomas was alone, and oddness was the only thing that might keep him breathing until spring. The mine shaft descended 43 feet into the ridge at a 20-degree angle, following what had once been a copper vein that pinched out and disappeared. The mining company had driven the main shaft back 118 feet before they'd given up, and there were 2 small side chambers where they'd explored lateral veins that had also failed to produce. Thomas had spent his first 3 days in the mine doing nothing but observing, measuring, and thinking. He'd learned from his grandmother that you didn't build until you understood what you were building with and what you were building against. If you want to find out how Thomas built a winter shelter that stayed at 54 degrees while the outside temperature dropped to 42 below zero, saving not just his own life, but eventually sheltering 16 people through the worst winter in Montana Territory's recorded history, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because what this 14-year-old orphan created would change how miners, trappers, and homesteaders across the northern Rockies thought about survival. The mine had several advantages that weren't immediately obvious. First, the entrance faced southeast, which meant it caught the low winter sun for 3 hours each morning. Second, the ridge above it rose another 200 feet, providing a massive thermal buffer between the living space and the worst of the weather. Third, the company had left behind substantial infrastructure, iron rails, timber supports, a broken ore cart, and most valuably, 70 feet of intact ventilation shaft that rose at an angle to a concealed opening 30 feet up the ridge. Fourth, and most important, there was a steady seep of groundwater from a crack in the western wall, producing about 2 gallons per day that collected in a natural basin. Thomas had brought his grandmother's journal, and he opened it to a page she'd written in 1874 about earth-sheltered construction. Her handwriting was careful and clear. The frost line in Ohio reaches 32 inches in a hard winter. Below that depth, soil temperature remains constant year-round at approximately 52-56 degrees. A structure that places its living space entirely below the frost line requires minimal heating because it's already starting from 52 degrees instead of from whatever frozen temperature exists above ground. The earth becomes your stove. Montana's frost line went deeper than Ohio's, but Thomas was already 40 feet below the surface. He'd tested the air temperature in the deepest chamber with a mercury thermometer he'd purchased for 60 cents at Hanson's store, and on a morning when the outside temperature was 38 degrees, the deep chamber registered 56 degrees. No fire, no stove, no effort, just the constant temperature of the earth itself. The conventional approach to winter survival in Montana Territory in 1891 was straightforward: build a tight cabin, stockpile massive quantities of firewood, and keep a fire burning day and night from October through April. A family could burn through 8 to 12 cords of wood in a single winter, and if the cold turned especially brutal, they might need more. Thomas had watched his uncle's household burn through a full cord in just 10 days during a cold snap the previous January. And even then, the cabin had been cold enough at night that water froze in the bucket by the door. The problem with that approach was simple physics, though few people thought about it in those terms. Heat moves from warm areas to cold areas, and it does so through 3 methods: conduction, convection, and radiation. A wooden cabin with thin walls lost heat through all 3 pathways simultaneously. The wood itself conducted heat from the warm interior to the cold exterior. The air inside the cabin, warmed by the fire, rose and escaped through every gap and crack in the roof and walls, pulling cold air in at the bottom, and the warm walls radiated heat outward into the freezing night. Fighting that constant heat loss required a constant supply of fuel, enormous effort, and even then, people froze. Thomas's approach was different because it worked with the earth instead of fighting the air. He spent the first week constructing a living wall across the mine shaft, 25 feet inside the entrance. He built it from river stone gathered from the creek a quarter-mile downslope, mixed with clay mud that he dug from a deposit near the mine entrance and tempered with dried grass. The wall was 4 feet thick at the base and rose 7 feet to meet the mine's timber-supported ceiling. He left a small opening in the center, 30 inches wide and 5 feet tall, just large enough to move through while carrying supplies. Clayton Brewster heard about the wall and rode up to the mine on a cold afternoon in early November with 2 of his ranch hands. Thomas was outside the mine entrance, shaping wooden planks with his father's saw to create a door for the opening. "Building a wall to keep the mountain out, boy," Brewster said from his horse. not bothering to dismount. "That mine's already got walls. They're called rock." Thomas set down the saw and straightened. He was thin from 2 years of inadequate meals at his uncle's house, but he'd grown 3 inches that summer, and his arms had muscle from weeks of hauling stone. "The rock keeps out the rain and the wind," he said evenly. "The wall keeps out the cold air that sinks into the mine shaft at night. Cold air is heavy. It flows downhill like water. If I don't block it, the entrance tunnel becomes a river of cold that flows right into my living space." One of the ranch hands snickered. "You hear that, Clayton? He thinks air flows like water." "It does," Thomas said. He pointed to the mine entrance. "You can feel it yourself if you stand there at sunset. Cold air pours down from the ridge, sinks into the mine entrance, and flows downward. I've measured the temperature difference. The entrance tunnel drops 8 degrees after sunset just from cold air flowing in. The wall blocks that flow." Brewster shook his head slowly, the gesture of a man witnessing foolishness he couldn't prevent. "We've been building homes in this territory for 20 years, and nobody builds walls inside mountains. You know why? Because it doesn't work. Come December, when the real cold hits, you're going to realize that all you've done is trap yourself in a stone coffin. The smart thing would be to come down to town, hire yourself out for winter work, sleep in a proper bunkhouse with a proper stove. But I can see you've got your grandmother's stubbornness along with her strange ideas." "My grandmother lived to 73 and never froze," Thomas said. "How many people in this valley can say that?" Brewster's face darkened. His own father had frozen to death in a blizzard in 1876, caught between the house and the barn in a whiteout. "You've got a smart mouth for someone who's going to be begging for help before Christmas. Don't come to my door when you realize you've made a mistake, because I don't help fools twice." He turned his horse and rode back down the trail, his men following. Thomas returned to his saw. He'd known Brewster wouldn't understand. People who'd invested heavily in conventional solutions rarely wanted to hear that there might be a better way, because that meant acknowledging that all their investment and effort had been unnecessary. The door he built for the wall opening was constructed from 3 layers. The outer layer was thick pine planks. The middle layer was packed moss and dried grass, 6 inches thick. The inner layer was more pine planks. The entire door was heavy enough that it took all his strength to lift into place, and he hung it on iron hinges he'd salvaged from the mine's abandoned equipment shed. He fitted it carefully to the opening so that the gaps were minimal, then packed those gaps with more moss. When he closed that door behind him, the living chamber beyond became almost completely sealed from the outside air. Behind the wall, Thomas had established his living quarters in the largest of the side chambers, a space roughly 15 feet wide, 20 feet deep, and 8 feet tall. This was where he would spend the winter. And this was where he'd applied every principle his grandmother had taught him. The floor had been bare rock when he'd arrived, uneven and cold. He'd covered it with a layer of fist-sized river stones, then a layer of sand, then a layer of flat slate pieces he'd split from a deposit he'd found upslope. The result was a floor that was smooth enough to walk on comfortably, and, more importantly, had substantial thermal mass. During the day, if he ran his small fire, the floor absorbed heat slowly. At night, after the fire died to coals, the floor released that heat slowly. The temperature gradient was gentle instead of the wild swings that happened in conventional cabins. The walls were solid rock, naturally insulating, but Thomas had done something unusual. He'd used clay mud to fill every crack and crevice where air might move, creating an airtight seal. Then he'd covered sections of the wall with tightly woven reed mats that he'd made himself from cattails gathered at a marsh 2 miles away. The mats created a 1/4-inch dead air space between themselves and the rock wall, and dead air was one of the best insulators available. His grandmother had written about this. Still air insulates. Moving air steals heat. Control the air, and you control the temperature. For heat, Thomas had built a small masonry stove in the corner, constructed from fire brick he'd found in the abandoned equipment shed, and river stones mortared with clay. The design was based on a sketch in his grandmother's journal, copied from a Finnish immigrant she'd known in Ohio. The stove was small, only 2 feet square, but it had an internal maze of channels that forced the hot smoke to travel through 20 feet of masonry before exiting through the stovepipe. That meant the fire's heat was absorbed into the thermal mass of the stove instead of flying up the chimney and disappearing. The stove could burn for 3 hours on a small load of wood, then radiate stored heat for 18 hours afterward. the stovepipe presented a challenge. In a conventional cabin, the stovepipe punched straight through the roof, creating a direct path for heat to escape. Thomas had the advantage of the mine's old ventilation shaft. He'd run his stovepipe into that shaft, and the smoke traveled 40 feet through the angled tunnel before emerging far up the ridge. That 40 feet of travel meant the smoke cooled as it moved, giving up its heat to the rock walls of the ventilation shaft. It was inefficient from a drafting perspective. Sometimes the stove was slow to draw, but it was remarkably efficient from a heat retention perspective. Very little warmth left his living chamber. By mid-November, Thomas had moved fully into the deep chamber. He'd furnished it simply. A bed frame built from scrap timber with a mattress stuffed with dried grass and moss. A small table, a stool, a storage trunk he'd built for his clothes and supplies, and a shelf for his grandmother's journal and his few books. He'd rigged a simple oil lamp for light, though he used it sparingly to conserve fuel. The chamber had a strange acoustic quality. Sounds were muffled and intimate, as though the rock absorbed the noise the way it absorbed heat. He kept careful records. Every morning at dawn and every evening at sunset, he measured the temperature inside his living chamber and the temperature outside the mine entrance. In mid-November, when the outside temperature dropped to 14 degrees at night, his chamber registered 54 degrees. He burned his stove for only 2 hours in the evening, using wood he'd gathered from deadfall in the surrounding forest. His fuel consumption was a fraction of what the families in the valley were burning. Thomas found work where he could. He was skilled with his hands, reliable, and quiet. And some of the ranchers would hire him for day labor when they needed an extra pair of hands for a job that didn't require a full-time worker. He repaired fences, mucked stables, split firewood for others while burning very little himself. He earned 50 cents here, $1 there. Every penny he didn't need for immediate survival went towards supplies: lamp oil, beans, flour, salt, a little dried meat. He bought a young barn cat from a rancher's wife for 25 cents, a scrawny orange tom that was good at catching mice. He named the cat Flint, and Flint took to the mine immediately, patrolling the tunnels and keeping the rodent population under control. People in town thought Thomas was strange, but they paid him for his work and didn't ask too many questions. The boy lived in a hole in the ground, but he showed up when he said he would and did the job properly. That counted for something. In early December, a young woman named Sarah Donnelly came to the mine. Sarah was 19, worked as a school teacher in Stevensville, and had a reputation for curiosity that her mother considered unladylike. She'd heard the stories about the boy living in the abandoned mine, and instead of dismissing them as tragic or foolish, she'd wondered if there might be something to learn. She arrived on a cold, bright afternoon, riding a chestnut mare and carrying a canvas bag. Thomas was outside the mine entrance, splitting firewood from a deadfall pine he'd dragged up the ridge. "Thomas Harlan," she called as she dismounted. Thomas set down the axe and nodded, cautious. Visitors usually came to mock or to tell him he was making a mistake. "I'm Sarah Donnelly. I teach at the school in Stevensville. I heard you're living through the winter in this mine, and I wanted to see for myself. Would you be willing to show me what you've built?" Thomas studied her for a moment. She didn't look like she was here to mock him. Her expression was open, interested. "Why?" he asked. "Because if you found a way to survive winter that doesn't require burning 8 cords of wood, that's worth knowing about," she said simply. "The schoolhouse is brutally cold. We go through so much firewood the school board complains every year. If there's a better method, I'd like to understand it." Thomas considered, then nodded. "All right, follow me." He led her through the mine entrance and down the sloping tunnel to the wall he'd built. When he opened the heavy triple-layer door and gestured for her to enter, she stepped through and stopped, her eyes widening. The first thing she noticed was the warmth. Not the blast of heat from a roaring fire, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once: the floor, the walls, the air itself. The second thing she noticed was how quiet it was. A profound stillness that felt almost sacred. "What temperature is it in here?" she asked. Thomas pointed to the thermometer hanging on the wall. 54 degrees. She stared at the thermometer, then at the small masonry stove in the corner, which had no fire burning in it. "How is that possible? It's 26 degrees outside," Thomas explained. He showed her the wall that blocked cold airflow, the triple-layer door, the sealed rock walls, the thermal mass of the stone floor. He explained how the earth itself maintained a constant temperature, and how his living chamber was positioned to benefit from that. He showed her the masonry stove and explained how it absorbed and radiated heat instead of losing it up a chimney. He walked her through the principles: thermal mass, insulation, air sealing, minimizing heat loss. Sarah listened with the focused attention of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. She asked intelligent questions. She touched the rock walls, feeling their gentle warmth. She knelt and pressed her palm to the stone floor. She examined the masonry stove's internal channels. "This is brilliant," she said finally. "Do people in town know about this?" "Clayton Brewster knows. He thinks I'm going to freeze to death." Thomas shrugged. "Most people think it's foolish to live underground." "Most people are burning money every time they throw wood on a fire," Sarah said. She looked around the chamber again, shaking her head slowly. "The school board spends $80 a year on firewood for a building we use 6 hours a day. You're living in comfort for a fraction of that. This isn't foolish, Thomas. This is the smartest thing I've seen since I came to Montana." It was the first time anyone besides his grandmother had told Thomas he was smart for building this way, instead of conventional. Something in his chest loosened slightly. Sarah stayed for an hour, taking notes in a small journal. When she left, she thanked him seriously and said she hoped to visit again. Thomas returned to splitting firewood, but the afternoon felt different somehow. Less lonely? December arrived with bitter cold. The first major storm hit on December 8th, dropping 2 feet of snow and driving the temperature down to 6 degrees. Thomas burned his stove for 3 hours that evening and let it die to coals overnight. In the morning, the inside temperature had dropped to 51 degrees. He added wood, brought the stove back to life, and within an hour the chamber was back to 55 degrees. He'd used perhaps an eighth of the wood that a conventional cabin would have required to stay marginally comfortable through the same night. He went into town on December 15th to buy supplies and heard the news at Hanson's store. Emily Pritchard, a widow who lived alone on a homestead claimed 5 miles up the valley, had been found dead in her cabin the previous morning. She'd run out of firewood 3 days earlier and frozen to death in her bed. She was 41 years old. Thomas stood in the store with a bag of flour in his hands and felt sick. Emily Pritchard hadn't needed to die. If she'd understood that she could have insulated her cabin with earth berms, or built even a partial underground shelter, or used thermal mass to reduce her fuel needs, she might still be alive. But that knowledge wasn't common anymore. People had forgotten the old ways, the ways that his grandmother had learned from people who'd lived close to the land for generations. 2 days later, a rancher named Douglas Kemp lost 3 fingers to frostbite when he got caught in a sudden storm between his house and his barn. The cold had been so severe that his hands had frozen despite heavy gloves, and the doctor in Stevensville had been forced to amputate. Christmas came and went. Thomas spent it alone, except for Flint, who curled on his lap in the evening while Thomas read by lamplight. He allowed himself a small celebration, an extra portion of beans with a little molasses, a piece of hard candy he'd bought weeks earlier and saved. The chamber was warm, the stove radiated gentle heat, and outside, the wind howled through the pines with a sound like wolves. The real test came in January. January of 1892 brought cold that Montana Territory had never recorded before. A massive high-pressure system settled over the northern Rockies and refused to move, bringing clear skies, still air, and temperatures that dropped like stones. On January 9th, the temperature in Stevensville fell to 28 degrees below zero. On January 12th, it hit 34 below, and on January 17th, the mercury in the thermometer outside Hanson's store dropped to 42 degrees below zero and stayed there for 2 days. People died. James Holloway, a miner, froze to death in his cabin when his stovepipe cracked and he couldn't keep a fire burning. Margaret Chen, a Chinese laundress, died in her sleep when her small shed proved inadequate against the cold. A trapper named Samuel Cross was found frozen solid on the trail, dead before he could reach shelter. The death toll across the Bitterroot Valley reached 17 by the end of January. Conventional structures were failing everywhere. Families burned through their entire winter wood supplies in weeks, then began burning furniture, floorboards, anything combustible. Even wealthy households like Clayton Brewster's were suffering. Brewster's youngest son, Peter, developed severe frostbite on both feet, despite the family burning wood constantly in 3 separate stoves. The boy would survive, but he'd walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Sarah Donnelly thought about Thomas up in his mine. She hadn't visited since early December, and with the cold this brutal, she was afraid of what she might find. He might have frozen, he might have given up and left, though no one in town had seen him, or possibly his strange underground shelter was actually working. On January 19th, when the temperature finally climbed back up to a merely brutal 15 below, Sarah made the journey. She wore every piece of warm clothing she owned, wrapped her face in scarves, and rode slowly, letting her mare pick the way through the snow-covered trail. The 5-mile journey took nearly 2 hours, and by the time she reached Mineral Ridge, she was chilled to the bone despite her layers. Her feet were numb in her boots, and her fingers ached even inside heavy mittens. She expected to find the mine entrance buried in snow, the place abandoned or worse. Instead, she found the entrance partially clear, with a narrow path shoveled to the door. There was a thin trail of smoke rising from somewhere up the ridge. The ventilation shaft, she remembered. Signs of life. She dismounted stiffly and approached the mine entrance. Her breath hung in the air like fog. She called out, her voice muffled by the scarf across her face. "Thomas, it's Sarah Donnelly." A moment later, the entrance door swung open and Thomas appeared. He was wearing a simple wool shirt, no coat. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows. He looked healthy, if surprised. "Sarah, what are you doing up here in this cold?" "I wanted to make sure you were still alive," she said through chattering teeth. "Can I come in?" "Of course." He stepped aside, and she hurried into the mine entrance tunnel, then followed him down to the wall and through the triple-layer door. The wave of warmth that hit her when she stepped into the living chamber was so overwhelming that she gasped. After 2 hours and 15 below cold, the 54-degree air felt like a furnace. She stood just inside the doorway, swaying slightly, while her body tried to process the sudden temperature change. Her face tingled painfully as frozen skin began to thaw. Her fingers burned. "Sit down before you fall down," Thomas said, guiding her to the stool by the table. He closed the door behind her. "You need to warm up slowly. Don't get too close to the stove yet." Sarah sat, fumbling with numb fingers to unwrap the scarves from her face. She looked around the chamber as sensation slowly returned to her extremities. The small masonry stove glowed with gentle heat. The stone floor radiated warmth through her boots. The air was comfortable, breathable, alive. Flint the cat lounged on Thomas's bed, unconcerned with the deadly cold outside. "What temperature is it in here?" she asked, though she could see the thermometer from where she sat. 54 degrees, Thomas said. "Same as always. It dropped to 51 during the worst of the cold last week, but that's as low as it's gone." 51 degrees, Sarah repeated slowly. "When it was 42 below outside." 56 below zero when you account for wind chill at the entrance, Thomas said. He retrieved a small notebook from his shelf and showed her. Columns of numbers, dates, temperatures inside and out, recorded faithfully twice per day. The outside temperature dropped to 42 below on the 17th. Inside dropped to 51. "I burned the stove for 4 hours that day, instead of my usual 2. Used about 6 pounds of wood." Sarah stared at the numbers. She thought about her own boarding house in Stevensville, where the landlady burned wood furiously, and the upstairs rooms still got cold enough at night that ice formed on the inside of the windows. She thought about the school, where the children sat huddled in coats because the stove couldn't keep up with the heat loss. She thought about 17 people dead. "Thomas," she said quietly, "do you understand what you've done here? While people all over this valley were freezing to death in their homes, you were comfortable underground with almost no fuel. This isn't just clever. This could save lives." Thomas looked uncomfortable with the praise. "It's just what my grandmother taught me. It's not new. Indigenous people have been building earth shelters for thousands of years. Settlers just forgot." "Then they need to remember," Sarah said firmly. "Will you teach me? Will you explain it clearly enough that I can explain it to others?" Thomas considered. His grandmother had never hoarded her knowledge. She'd taught anyone who asked, believing that survival wisdom should be shared, not kept secret. "Yes," he said. "I'll teach you." Over the next 2 hours, Thomas walked Sarah through every principle he'd applied. He explained thermal mass and showed her how the stone floor stored heat. He explained the constant earth temperature below the frost line and how his deep placement took advantage of that. He demonstrated the masonry stove's efficiency, showing how the internal channels captured heat that would otherwise escape. He explained air sealing and how preventing infiltration was more important than adding insulation. He showed her his records, proving with data what he'd achieved. Sarah took notes as fast as her warming hands could write. She asked questions until she understood not just what Thomas had done, but why it worked. She was a teacher. She knew the difference between memorizing steps and understanding principles. When she finally prepared to leave, she stood at the door for a moment, looking back at the chamber. "You know Clayton Brewster's son Peter got severe frostbite," she said. "They've got 3 stoves burning constantly in that big house, and the boy still nearly lost his feet. Meanwhile, you're down here in comfort. That tells you something about conventional wisdom, doesn't it?" Thomas nodded slowly. He'd heard about Peter. He didn't wish the boy harm, but there was a bitter irony in it. "I'm going to tell people," Sarah said. "I'm going to explain what you've done. Some will listen, some won't, but they should at least know there's another way." "Tell them," Thomas said. "My grandmother would have wanted that." Sarah made the cold journey back to Stevensville and immediately began talking. She told other teachers, she told parents, she told anyone who would listen about the boy living comfortably through the worst winter in memory while using almost no fuel. Most people were skeptical. Some thought she was exaggerating or had been fooled, but some listened with genuine interest, especially those who'd struggled most with the cold. By early February, curiosity overcame skepticism for several people. A rancher named William Grant rode up to the mine to see for himself. A trapper named Louis Beaumont, who spent winters in a crude cabin and nearly froze every year, made the journey. A young couple, newly married and struggling in a drafty homestead cabin, came together. Each time, the experience was the same. They arrived frozen, skeptical, expecting to find a miserable boy barely surviving. Instead, they found comfortable warmth, careful engineering, and undeniable data. Thomas showed them his thermometer readings, demonstrated his systems, explained the principles. Most left thoughtful, minds working on how they might apply what they had learned. In mid-February, Clayton Brewster came. He arrived alone, on horseback, in the late morning. Thomas was outside the mine entrance, checking the ventilation shaft for ice blockage. He heard the horse and turned, surprised. Brewster looked older than he had in November, his face drawn and exhausted. "Morning, Mr. Brewster," Thomas said neutrally. Brewster dismounted stiffly. He looked at the mine entrance, at the thin smoke rising from the ventilation shaft, at Thomas standing there in nothing but a wool shirt despite the 20-degree temperature. "I heard you made it through the cold spell," Brewster said. "Sarah Donnelly says you never went below 50 degrees inside." 51, Thomas corrected. "On the 17th. Brewster nodded slowly. He was quiet for a long moment. "My boy Peter nearly lost his feet. Doctor says he'll limp. We were burning 3 stoves day and night, going through firewood like it was kindling, and we still couldn't keep the house properly warm. Meanwhile, you're up here in a played-out mine, comfortable." He looked directly at Thomas. "I need to understand how." It wasn't an apology. Clayton Brewster wasn't the kind of man who apologized easily, but it was an admission that he'd been wrong, and that mattered. "Come inside," Thomas said. He led Brewster through the entrance, down the tunnel, through the triple-layer door. Brewster stopped just inside the living chamber, and Thomas watched the man's face register the same shock everyone experienced, the immediate, undeniable warmth, the comfort that shouldn't exist this deep in winter. "Lord above," Brewster said softly. Thomas showed him everything. He walked Brewster through the design, the reasoning, the principles. He showed him the temperature records, months of data proving the system worked. He explained thermal mass, earth temperature, heat retention. He demonstrated the masonry stove's efficiency. Brewster listened without interrupting, his weathered rancher's hands resting on the table while Thomas talked. When Thomas finished, Brewster was quiet for a long time. "My father froze to death in a blizzard," Brewster said finally. 1876. I was 14, same age you are now. He got lost between the house and the barn in a whiteout, and we found him frozen the next morning. Ever since then, I've been afraid of winter. I build big fires, stockpile wood, do everything I can to keep the cold away. And this year, It almost wasn't enough. He looked around the chamber again, shaking his head. "You're telling me the answer wasn't to fight harder. It was to work with the earth instead of against the weather." "Yes, sir," Thomas said quietly. Brewster stood, preparing to leave. At the door, he paused. "Would you be willing to advise on some construction? I've got a bunkhouse I'm planning to rebuild come spring. I'd pay you for your time and knowledge." Thomas blinked, surprised. "Yes, sir. I'd be willing." "Good." Brewster nodded once, then left. Word spread through the valley like wildfire after that. If Clayton Brewster, the wealthiest rancher in the territory, was consulting with the boy in the mine, then maybe there was something to it after all. People who'd been skeptical suddenly became curious. Thomas found himself with more visitors than he wanted, but he answered their questions patiently, showed them his systems, explained the principles his grandmother had taught him. By March, 3 families were making plans to build partially underground shelters come spring. William Grant had already started excavating a hillside on his property. Louis Beaumont was designing a trapline shelter based on Thomas's principles. Sarah Donnelly convinced the school board to consider earth-berming the schoolhouse's north wall to reduce heating costs. Thomas continued living in the mine through March and into April. When the spring thaw finally came and the snow melted, he'd successfully survived the worst winter in Montana Territory's recorded history, while using less wood than most families burned in a single week. In May, Clayton Brewster hired Thomas to consult on his new bunkhouse. They designed it partially into a hillside, with earth berms on 3 sides, a masonry stove based on Thomas's design, and careful attention to air sealing and thermal mass. The bunkhouse was completed in August, and the ranch hands who lived there that next winter reported it was the most comfortable winter quarters they'd ever experienced. Brewster paid Thomas $60 for his work, more money than Thomas had ever had at once. Over the next 5 years, Thomas designed and helped build 14 structures across the Bitterroot Valley using earth-sheltered principles. Some were full underground shelters like his mine chamber. Others were conventional buildings with earth berms, improved stoves, and better insulation. All of them performed dramatically better than traditional construction. In 1893, a professor from the University of Montana traveled to Stevensville to meet the young man who'd survived the winter of 1892 in an abandoned mine. Professor David Mitchell studied Thomas's design, took measurements, and interviewed him extensively. He published a paper in a territorial engineering journal titled "Indigenous Building Principles Applied to Modern Survival Needs," a case study from Mineral Ridge. The paper brought attention from across the territory and even from back east. Thomas never sought fame or profit. He continued living simply, taking work where he found it, teaching anyone who asked about earth-sheltered building. He married Sarah Donnelly in 1896, when he was 19 and she was 24. They built a house together on a piece of land near Stevensville, partially earth-sheltered with a masonry stove, and raised 4 children there. Thomas lived in Montana for the rest of his life, working as a builder and occasional consultant. He never became wealthy, never sought recognition. He built structures that worked, taught people who wanted to learn, and lived according to the principles his grandmother had passed down to him. He died in 1954 at the age of 77, outliving Sarah by 3 years. By then, the techniques he had demonstrated in that abandoned mine had influenced hundreds of buildings across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. His funeral was attended by more than 200 people, including descendants of families whose lives had been saved by the shelters he'd designed, students he'd taught, and builders who'd learned from his methods. His granddaughter Margaret gave the eulogy. She spoke about a boy who'd been kicked out at 14 and found a solution in an abandoned mine, who'd questioned conventional wisdom and proven that sometimes the old ways were better than the new, who'd lived his values quietly and taught generously. "He used to say that you don't fight nature, you work with it," Margaret said, standing before the crowded church. "He said the earth would provide what you needed if you understood how to listen. And he proved it every day of his life, from that first winter in the mine to his last years in the house he built with my grandmother. Rest now, Grandpa. Grandma Mary is waiting, and the shelters you built still stand." The original mine chamber on Mineral Ridge still exists. It was stabilized and preserved in 1978 as a historical site, modernized with thick electric lighting and improved ventilation, but keeping the core design intact. Visitors come from across the country to see the place where a 14-year-old orphan survived a deadly winter using principles that mainstream culture had forgotten. There are memorial plaques at the entrance, one for Thomas Harlan, one for his grandmother Mary, and one for Flint the cat, who lived to the remarkable age of 16 and was buried on the ridge above the mine. The winter of 1892 tested an assumption that had gone unchallenged in Montana territory, that the way things had always been done was the way they should continue. Conventional wisdom said you built wooden houses above ground, stockpiled massive amounts of firewood, and burned constantly to survive winter. That approach had worked adequately in mild winters, but when the cold turned truly deadly, it failed. 17 people froze to death while surrounded by the most advanced heating technology of their era. Thomas Harlan proved that approach wrong, not with theory, but with a thermometer, not with argument, but with the simple fact of his survival. The principles he used were ancient, developed by indigenous peoples across North America over thousands of years. The ancestral Puebloans built cliff dwellings that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter through thermal mass and careful orientation. The Plains tribes used earth lodges that required minimal heating. The Inuit built structures that trapped heat efficiently in the Arctic. These weren't primitive techniques. They were sophisticated engineering based on deep understanding of physics and climate. Modern science has confirmed what Thomas's grandmother knew intuitively. The earth below the frost line maintains a constant temperature year-round, typically between 50 and 57 degrees, depending on latitude and local geology. Structures that place living space at that depth, or that use the earth as insulation, start from that baseline temperature instead of fighting external extremes. Thermal mass, dense materials that absorb and release heat slowly, smooths out temperature swings and reduces the amount of active heating or cooling required. Air sealing prevents heat loss through infiltration and exfiltration, which accounts for 25 to 40% of heat loss in conventional construction. Thomas succeeded because he was willing to question assumptions. He had nothing, no money, no tools, no support. But he had observation, patience, and willingness to learn from traditions that mainstream culture had dismissed. He looked at worthless land and saw possibility. He looked at an abandoned mine and saw a home. He looked at brutal cold and saw a problem that could be solved through design instead of brute force. What the mining company built quickly and cheaply collapsed and was abandoned within 6 years. What a 14-year-old orphan built slowly and carefully still stands 134 years later. There's a lesson in that about extraction versus stewardship, about knowledge shared versus knowledge hoarded, about taking what you need versus building what will last. Thomas Harlan never became famous in his lifetime, never wrote books, never sought recognition. He simply lived, raised his family, helped his neighbors, and taught when asked. He built 31 structures over his lifetime, providing comfortable shelter for hundreds of people through decades of Montana winters. Most of those structures are gone now, replaced by modern buildings with central heating and modern insulation. But the knowledge survives, preserved in historical records, academic papers, and the living memory of families who still tell stories about the boy who lived in the mine. So, here's the question for you. What abandoned space exists in your life? What dismissed resource has everyone written off as worthless? What might happen if you looked at it the way Thomas looked at that played-out mine? Not as a dead end, but as a beginning. Not as a failure, but as raw material for something new. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about survival, about questioning conventional wisdom, about the value of traditional knowledge that our modern world too often dismisses, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Leave a comment about what spoke to you, and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things through observation, patience, and courage. Because sometimes the best shelter isn't given to you. Sometimes it's the one you build with your own 2 hands, the wisdom of those who came before, and the willingness to see possibility where everyone else sees only abandonment.